Okay. Thank you everyone for tuning in to the Pharaoh's Ethical Open Science for Past Global Change Data, RCN's final webinar of 2025. We're fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Liz Dowding. Liz is a paleobiogeographer and postdoctoral researcher at Friedrich Alexander University, working with the Geozentrum Nordbayern Research Center. Liz's research applies quantitative and phylogenetic methods to uncover biogeographic patterns, study paleoecosystems, and biodiversity response to climate and environmental change, with a particular affinity for the Devonian time period, I am told. More recently, her research has contributed to advancing data equity and data citation practices in paleontology, and we're delighted to be hearing about some of this work today. And so, without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Liz. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so very, very much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure. Um, I'm Elizabeth Dowding. I'm from Darwell country in Australia. And I'm particularly thrilled to be invited to an event like this because under my worldview, it's the kind of community action that brings about the change that, or the structural change that I'm looking for and hope to live within in the future. So to that end, I would like to introduce some work that I've been doing with the Palaeosynthesis Project, which is the brainchild of Professor Dr. Wolfgang Kiesling here at FAU, and the same titles for Manuel Steinbauer down at Beirut. I said that with a weird accent, please let me apologize. But essentially, it identified that paleontology is a threatened species amongst academic discourses. And in an attempt to both preserve it and also reinvigorate it in some way, it was to bring together a bunch of different working groups who would attempt to answer really exciting questions in a collaborative setting. Some of them are really interested in long scale and large scale eco-evolutionary problems that the paleontological record deals with excellently. And others are more reflexive looks, such as this one, which is the Integrated Record of Ancient Life Working Group, which was led by Dr. Emma Dunn and Dr. Adam Kotchis, who is at Trinity and here respectively. So within that working group, we've just had a paper accepted that is about fossils for future, and it's a advocacy piece about paleontology's digital data infrastructure, focusing on open access and community-run resources. And what we wanted to talk about in that was really what representative data is, both in terms of the scientific questions that we're attempting to answer, but also in terms of the data landscape, what it represents about us as a community of people who are interested in both creating and sharing knowledge. So to that end, I would like to introduce the data landscape and ask the question of, well, why do we build databases? Primarily, databases are kind of constructed because we have big questions. And so I'm giving another shout out to a paleosynthesis project led by Dr. Jansen Smith, which was the big questions in paleontology. What databases allow us to do is essentially kind of bridge the cognitive horizon of an individual person's career and lifespan. It allows us to collate and curate information from a wide range and a wide span of data types and data and times in order to answer some of these big questions that we might not necessarily have been able to have done if we were working in isolation. So foundationally, our motivation is one out of curiosity and care for the questions that we have. It speaks to a kind of deep disciplinary need and also a desire to share. In this way, databases are really nice mirrors of our community priorities. This figure from the same paper illustrates also that there's a lot of interconnectedness, not just within paleontology, but also within life sciences in general. So a database such as the Paleobiology database, which is one of the largest and longest running open access community run databases, initially started as a way to look at diversity dynamics throughout the history of metazoan life in particular. But it is now one of the foundational resources for an entire community. And we saw its core utility as this community given resource during COVID, where I think many of our career trajectories shifted from collections and field work into analysis. So even though it's driven by these deep disciplinary needs and the burning questions to understand our natural world, it really is also about finding a way to connect and make innovative use of the resources that are already extant. In order to kind of understand how we got to where we are and what the values of databases are, we did that classic paleontology thing. And I'm sure there's a range of disciplines in here, but today I'm going to address you all as if you're honorary paleontologists. So welcome into the fold. So paleontologists, we love to understand the processes in the time that we're looking at by looking back. We want to observe the patterns and kind of bring in mechanisms and causes to try and fill in how we got to the observed patterns of the and processes that are in our target question. So I applied similar ideas, did its diversity dynamics, looking at extinction and origination of particularly open access and community developed databases. And the reason for that was I figured that they were most representative of who we are as a community and our research interests. Because they're not necessarily funded directly by governments and they're not supported by industry. They are ground swelling of interest and of community effort. I ascertained if they were living or extinct under standard procedure of finding their first and last occurrences within the fossil record, which is otherwise known as Web of Science and Google Scholar. What this allowed me to do was to create kind of a life history and stack up the different segments through time and establish some of the patterns that we're seeing. And what I find really interesting is that you can really see in panel A that there is this really large peak, really large spike in the volume, the number and richness of the databases that are open access. But this is also coinciding in panel C with a very short lifespan compared to the amount of effort that it goes in. So you can probably see that by the time you get to 10 years, the vast majority of these databases are no longer active, or under the terminology I've used, they've gone extinct. What this also indicates, outside of the general trends, is there's also this development of the back end, the behind the scenes of database infrastructure. So when we started with the initial data stack, it would be very simplistic, maybe even just a digital representation of a spreadsheet that was made open and available. And it has now migrated into these very complicated SQL relational databases. And now that we're moving into the realms of machine learning and data lakes and things, the focus is beginning to change once again in terms of how we're creating and structuring these databases. I think it's important to note that these are also people who are not necessarily database developers. These are paleontologists most of the time who are interested in creating and curating these resources for themselves and for their community. So it really is kind of a remarkable testament to the excitement, innovation, and enthusiasm of the community that we're a part of. I'm very proud of us, frankly. I draw particular focus to this because in the realm of what I was speaking about in terms of the technological development, there was a paper in 2018 that was talking about dark data. And I think it's on the next slide, by Marshall et al. And within that, the team mentioned the first and second digital revolutions in paleontology. And I think in this figure, you can really see that is certainly extant, at least in terms of just the base richness. So the first digital revolution does coincide with this opening of the internet, I suppose, in some ways, but also of increased access to computers for researchers. And then we move into the second digital revolution, where it does become much more relational, and we start to pool vast amounts of different data into a cohesive data stack. And so it becomes a bit more deliberately integrative into that period of time. Something interesting does happen, though, in the middle, around 2015, you start to see a drop again. And there are a couple of reasons that this might be. But one of them is that potentially we are actually moving into the third digital revolution. Our focus into novel creation of databases has begun to change. And part of the reason is for that is that databases are in part very expensive. Databases are expensive to fill with novel data. And so we've started to create fewer novel databases, but rather create aggregators or databases that take data from a primary database, say from the PBDB, and then subsume it into this new structure. And those were generally counted as subset databases, which I think is potentially coming into that trend. What that trend to me tells us is that we're beginning to think about interoperability and the concept of FAIR, which is within this group's purview, but I'll introduce it as findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. What this also showed, I think, is that, once again, I return to enthusiasm, but there were some very long-lived databases. You can see in panel C that there weren't very many, but some of them are over 30 years old. And this was extremely fun for me to find because it allowed us to actually speak more towards the community aspect of data building. And what we found was that there were three main pillars of database sustainability, and we called those community buy-in, individual maintenance, and structural collaboration. We have here Neotoma, the PBDB, and Neptune Sandbox. The PBDB, I think, is pretty unique in terms of its approach to community buy-in. Of the three listed here, it is the database that has primarily been supported by individuals uploading data. So data producers, data collators, taking the information that generally they've applied for grants for, that are taxpayer funded in the countries within they're working, and then donating this to the database and to the community, often at cost for data entry as well. Neotoma is in both because it does in two sections, because it does this also. But what Neotoma does that's slightly different to the PBDB is that it also has a constituent database model where it becomes a larger umbrella structure and holds within it smaller, comparatively, databases, which it then supports whilst they maintain their individual identity and can update and maintain themselves. The last one for long-term survivorship is individual maintenance. And shout out to Johan Rinaldi, who currently is the maintainer of the Neptune Sandbox database. And this has been kind of an intermittently funded database where it's been the dedicated volunteering of an individual in maintaining this resource. Neptune is quite special because it is one of those important feeder databases that have contributed to novel databases like BioDeepTime and Triton. So interoperability is something that is becoming much more important. And I know, for example, within the PBDB, they're beginning to redesign with this in mind. But how we got to this space where they're able to survive so long is always by volunteers and by community buy-in and collaboration. So this again comes back to the notion of the data as representative scientifically, but also as representative of us as a scientific community. This innovative, motivated, and curious impulse that we have is sometimes a bit of a problem, though, because we've had this proliferation of databases and the different kinds of databases, each kind of have their unique bespoke solution to whatever their question might be. Whilst there are fields at the back end of database development that are pretty consistent, every single paleontological database, for example, will require a taxonomy field and also a references field. The way that these are handled can be quite different in different databases. And if you're attempting to pool and integrate resources across multiple databases, it can be a really significant hindrance in terms of integration. And so if the key idea of moving into a third generation of paleontological databases is this idea of an integrated data landscape rather than a series of data islands, then this excitement and innovation and movement towards creating bespoke solutions can be a bit of a pickle for us that we're going to have to overcome. And so here is this kind of graphically represented, and you can see in the different databases, whether they're large or small, that they have these repeated elements over and over again. And that means that each of the people who are developing these databases are independently developing a solution for it. in some ways, this is quite exciting because you can kind of see the different solutions to the same problem. In other ways, it is a lot of repeated effort for the people who are developing.
Yes.
Wolfgang, I can hear you. Yeah, so it can be a bit of a problem in terms of repeated effort and also interrupting with interoperability. So once again, I return to a classic paleontological problem. Is this one of the environmental challenges in our data landscape? Is this constant running to try and find a solution, but also reinventing elements that already exist? Is this one of the things that we could really hone in on in terms of improving our ability to be fair and to focus on interoperability and reproducibility? I would like to reiterate that once again that this is always about the enthusiasm and the community mindedness of the paleontology and the sciences groups. Another trend that we found within the analysis is, of course, that there is economic challenges within maintenance and sustaining these databases. Smaller databases in particular, they are tied to 5, 10-year, 15-year cycles, and this roughly coincides with significant grants. And these grants tend to be motivated or be applied for by people at a certain career stage and with view to begin building. But they also mean that at the end of the granting period, the grant given period, there is the risk of all of this investment, both in time and money and in data aggregation for the resources that they've created. So economic challenges are a challenge to the group, but because they're not a motivator, I do believe that we will continue to develop this. The need for creating databases will maintain, and by focusing on groups like this one and community building, we begin to perhaps set the scene for a better, potentially better way of harnessing all that energy that we already have within the community. And so that's what Fossils for Future, the advocacy piece, was essentially trying to do. And it was we presented a roadmap to sustainable funding that focused on some tangible steps that could be done. For example, providing the costs to replace of the data, and how funders please acknowledge that it's actually cheaper to maintain the infrastructure that we have than to let it go to waste or to reinvent it when need arises again. I will cover aspects of this as we go. So we also made sure to comment specifically on the shared benefits of both open science as fair as decision-making, both in terms of the development of databases from a structural level, but also in terms of our advocacy for ourselves out. And this was allowing us to talk also about the collective benefits for all people sometimes, and other times, specific elements, whether that be funders and policymakers, depending on who the stakeholder might be. But then this is where I begin to move into the sort of the representative data as what the data represents about us, is that fair must be tempered by care. And actually, I would tend to go a little bit stronger in terms of my terminology. I think that care must negate fair if we want to be having a globally representative suite of data available for the community to use. So here I will provide some Australian examples and localized within the Australian experience of why care is important and how sometimes care has to negate fair. A simple example is, of course, that it can be quite difficult at the moment to get some large mammal data from Australia. And part of the reason for that is the antagonistic relationship between academia and the First Nations people. From the academic side, I would like to point out. And so I'm going to move in a little bit to some of the context of that and how I support the notion of rejection in terms of when requesting samples and access to field sites, because of course these are the traditional lands and their sovereignty not ceded countries. As I move into this particular point, I would like to highlight that by expertise, I am a natural scientist. And whilst I have an interest in social and political theory, and I've had the great benefit of having studied post-colonial eco-criticism as part of, like as a core feature of my undergraduate, I am speaking as a paleontologist advocating to paleontologists, not as an expert. And I will happily take any criticism. General framing is very important within discussions about this. And so because I'm assuming that I'm talking to a scientific audience, and though I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge yourself about post-colonial theory, I will still be providing definitions or key resources just in case. I would hate to be misunderstood. Framing is particularly important because there are going to be a suite of contextual differences between an Australian perspective on post-colonial interaction with academia, and perhaps where the majority of you are localized, I believe, in the United States. So to that end, I will be talking about the intersections of race and gender, but I'll be framing them as social constructs, not as an element of bioessentialism. And by this, I mean that social constructs are things that we believe exist and therefore they do exist. A really good example of this would be the economy, which of course is not tangible and not findable out in nature, but because we believe in it and because we buy into it by a series of social contracts, we have made it real. And it has actually become such a powerful force that people live, die, thrive by it. It has also reshaped the ecosystem. So when I say things like race, it's the way that you've been racialized. And when I talk about the intersections with gender, it is in a similar frame. And this is all just a key on transdisciplinary communication. When discussing elements like this, and I think it's actually very helpful for any scientist, a positionality statement is a key element because whilst objectivity is a goal that we strive for, it is not possible. Under epistemology and how we build knowledge, knowledge sits at the intersection of fact and truth, well, fact and belief. And so the way that we create narrative and the way that we communicate stories is filtered through the way that we have been taught, the way that we learn. And I think that becomes increasingly evident, especially as we begin to cross potentially interdisciplinary boundaries. As a biogeographer, sometimes I'll be talking about extinction in a different way to a paleoecologist. Even though we're both talking about extinction, the scale is very different and it's byproduct of our position. So I hope you enjoy my positionality statement and carry it forward as I explain the academic landscape in Australia. Hopefully by the end of this section, I will have convinced you of three things. One, that FAIR is not alone, that FAIR alone is not enough, that care must shape how we govern the future of paleontological data as we move into the third generation. And this is because our data landscape is a product of history. And as paleontologists, we're very good at explaining how the past has influenced the patterns that we observe. And we need to be critical of the processes and our place within those processes. And the last point is that community and the community we have built for ourselves will be the thing that creates the energy and builds our present and future, or changes our present and develops our future. So within Australia, the Indigenous people and First Nations people are made up of over 250 different language groups and more than 780 different dialects. It is an extremely diverse group, and it hosts some of the oldest continuous cultures on the planet. Some of the upper estimates are around 80,000 years, some of the confirmed are around 50,000 years. So these are extremely long lineages, and the cultural memory of the Indigenous people is extremely, extremely long. When I talk about First Nations people, they and Indigenous people. I am being reductive of the diversity there, but I'm talking about it in the context of a post-colonial place. And so the colonizer then and the settler is then any non-Indigenous inhabitant of Australia, whether they arrived yesterday voluntarily or whether they came unwillingly as a convict. So the history of Australia from that is relevant to this particular discussion about academia, paleontology databases, and the care principles is that the British Empire claimed Australia in 1770 under the premise of terra nullius. And what this meant was that there was nobody there. There were no people there. And this particular perspective of the fact that the Indigenous people were not people has continued until the roughly through to Mabo's like 1956, it became formalized. So colonization, which is bringing in generally people from the UK and Ireland, began in 1788. And the codification of Australia as a white place was put in with the White Australia policy at Federation in 1901 and was only overturned in 1973. So Australia is a really amazing example of the fluctuating position of whiteness and how whiteness and the notion of a white race is completely dependent on proximity to power and to hegemony. And by this, I mean, you can see that at the initial stages during the penal colony, the Irish people who were brought over unwillingly during a local genocide of their own, they were counted as not white. And then through the 1950s, there was a new group that were allowed in from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so the construction of whiteness changed until 1973, where we overturned it and moved into an explicit policy of multiculturalism. So against this is the consistent position of the Indigenous people as Black, generally spelled B-L-A-K. And this is the position that I'm going to be talking about in terms of the care landscape, multicultural, settler Australia, and Indigenous. So academia within Australia is born out of Western class hierarchies. And by this I mean is that it was transposed from Europe onto the Australian continent. And as it spread over the Australian continent, it actively sought to invalidate all other ways of knowing. And there's Vandana Shiva is a really important person in terms of ecofeminism and describing this. And in her words, she says that what we call science is a very narrow patriarchal project for a very short period of history. We name as science that which is mechanistic and reductionist, but that kind of science that Bacon, Descartes, and others called the fathers of modern science created. Domination of nature, exploitation of nature, declaring nature is dead, and then using a mechanistic reductionist mode. But this was born at a time when the Cultural Revolution needed exploitative knowledge, and that knowledge for exploitation was then treated as the only reliable knowledge, whereas the knowledge of protection, conservation, rejuvenation, regeneration, that which is actually the vital knowledge, and that which women have, which peasants have, which tribal and Indigenous people have, that was put into the garbage bin. So in the words of Audre Lorde, academia is one of the master's tools, and it has been used and weaponized in multiple ways to dehumanize people, but it has also reinforced in Australia the concept of terra nullius, because all of the places and all of the animals that were present in Australia had their own names, and the scientists came in and stamped over them with Latin and Greek and ignored all of the local and Indigenous knowledge until it became relevant to them. For example, there's a cultural practice of backburning, and this was discontinued, leading to some of the most catastrophic fires in Australia's history, of which we lost 70% of koala habitat. This cultural practice was then reinstated as a scientific practice once it had proven to be useful. And that practice has then been secondarily returned back as an acknowledgement to the Indigenous people. So there's this constant invalidation of knowledge by the people who are experts in a way that academics cannot, or external academics cannot be. And within this frame, there's also the problem, which I think is pointed out by Fanon very, very well, about the intersection between race and capitalism, and how the racism is in some ways required. The dehumanization in some ways is required for the capitalist structure to maintain its extractivist procedures. And so in this way, even if we are intending to do outreach, quote unquote, with Indigenous people to teach them the names of things they have had names for thousands of years, it can sometimes and often is a harmful practice. And this harm is decidedly one way, given the nature of the power structure in Australia at the moment. I will say some very, very positive things, though, about academia in particular, and Fanon himself points this out, is that there is significant position for the intellectual within these movements. Fanon, however, does not center academia as the location of the intellectual, and instead points out that the cost of participation in academia very much differs between who you are and whether you were allowed access to it from the start, or whether the doors have just been opened to you secondarily. Within the Australian context, this is extremely important, once again, in terms of data sovereignty and data control, because the way that the scientists within academia have been learning or talking to Indigenous people has definitely been one of claiming their knowledge as discoveries. I never quite finished a paper, which I called the Koala Bear Index, or the Koala Bias Index, which basically just counted the number of unique specimens, or the nature of endemicity between post-colonial places and non-post-colonial places, and highlighted that you're more likely to have relationships biogeographically between the areas that you were that the scientists had come from. For example, the koala bear was identified as a bear, not as a marsupial, and so biogeographically, its evolutionary history would go through Asia and into Europe. But because it's a marsupial, its biogeographic history was actually Gondwanan. So these things are all interacting, and so I think it's very important that we remember that the care principles offer us the ability to improve how we interact with data, to improve our to improve our community for ourselves, and that liberation at the end of the day does actually liberate us all. Everybody is improved by it. Just the cost of participation drastically differs. So how do we get there then? I think that one of the key things is to actually just acknowledge that this is a harmful tool, that many of the reasons that we as paleontologists are so interested is because we are deeply curious and we want to get out there and study the natural world. And I really like paleontology. I really enjoy the way that I get to consider and to look for drivers and causes. I like that I can focus in onto a particular group, for example. But that doesn't mean that academia itself is not a structure that has been harmful. It also doesn't mean that the inequities of the structures in Australia aren't reinforced by some of the extractivist process when we focus primarily on fair to the exclusion of care. And this process that I was mentioning is a form of digital colonization. And so in returning very strongly to what our databases represent about us, there was a great study by Raja, and then I think is in the audience herself, which highlighted that colonization and different GDPs have significant influence both on the access internationally to data, but also some of the interpretations that we're getting from it. So by fixing these and addressing these and creating structures within our community and within our databases that support a much more care focus, we, one, counter digital colonialism, but two, make a data suite that's representative of us and our intentions as a community, and three, possibly actually improve, well, definitely improve our ability to answer some of the questions that we're super curious about answering. in order to meet this, well, what does that look like? It's all very good and well to have a nice question. I mean, a nice conversation about it. I do think conversation is going to be one of the most important tools we have in fixing this, but there are also technical solutions that mirror our intentions. And I present modularity as one of these. So I think I pointed out earlier that the data landscape is a series of data islands with bespoke solutions to the same elements. What modularity does, it divides these repeated elements up. And so you could probably just download as pro forma some of these elements to, and then really focus on that novel element or that novel data table and novel data structure that is required to answer your question. Adam Koshis, who was one of the proposers of the IRL, he is currently working on a novel data structure for biotic interactions. And by working with the BioDeepTime database, he was able to borrow some of the data structures there and not have to repeat that work. By providing the data structure for generally consistent elements, we, one, improve our access to FAIR because the design is already built into interoperability. But we also allow for access to CARE, which means because it allows us to nimbly respond to different data scenarios, different locations, and different community scenarios. We can really focus on the elements that we want to be scientifically representative, but also representative of us. What this is in a philosophical sense in terms of how this relates to management, because we are a loose association, our data structure does represent us. We're an international community of paleontologists, but we're not centralized in any way. We're just kind of working on these islands and these pockets. This allows us to maintain some of that shared and collective power. It doesn't centralize, even though perhaps that might be more efficient, but it certainly won't be more responsive. And as we've seen in general structures in terms of the marketplace, centralization doesn't necessarily breed innovation. Diversity in this way, diversity of thought, diversity of person, diversity of perspective and positionality, then is one of the greatest opportunities for us to actually find innovation and answer questions innovatively. And from the short, pluralism is a political theory or a system of power sharing amongst a number of political parties. And I think that Neotoma already has a pretty pluralist back-end management and curatorial structure, which I think is a great model. Yeah. So before I close out, I put the rocks up first because my blue sky is going to be some lovely sandstone. But I think it's very important also that we focus on what the blue sky vision of this third generation of databases, like this FAIR and CARE intertwined, what it structurally looks like, but also what it means for us as a community. Because if we only focus on the things that we don't like and we tailor our actions to the things that we don't like about our community and our data, then all of our actions are just going to be mirrors of those things. We're not going to be able to necessarily move past them into better solutions. So the blue sky for our community. And I would suggest, and it has to be a community action, so it can be disagreed with or altered, and it should be. But essentially, we're looking for secure environments for scientists and all people interested in science. We want that to be shared and accessible. We're looking for epistemic plurality. And by this, I mean we're no longer invalidating other systems of knowledge. We can still sit there and get excited about our and work within ours, but we're going to be much more, we're going to know the limits of our knowledge and seek to validate the expertise of others. And this will help with transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research, even within paleontology. I would argue that we should reconstruct trust, and that is by doing something that paleontologists actually do very well, which is deal with rejection. If groups say that you cannot collect data and you cannot share data from a particular area because of reasons of their own, we accept that rejection and we move on. I mean, we've all had papers rejected, so I feel like we can manage. And In this way, we're investing in representative data that is both scientifically meaningful, but also represents our community and who we want our community to be. So in like a quick summary is that our data landscape really is pretty amazing. The position that paleontologists have always had, from the minute that we had the ability to open up our data resources and share them, we were interested in doing that. And we have continued to do that for the last 30, 40 years, which I think is a significant testament. Our community action has supported long-lived databases and fundamentally changed the careers of multiple people and increased data equity and access globally. We just need to keep sight of the fact that extraction is no longer going to be or ought not to be the goal, but rather collaboration. And so hopefully we will be able to move through these things that I've hopefully convinced you of to this third generation, to this representative data. And yeah, I hope you liked that. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Liz, for a fascinating and very deep talk. So much to think about there, and I appreciate all of the papers that you highlighted as well. We have some time now for questions. Everyone is welcome to use the raise hand button or put your questions in the chat or come off of mute. Questions for Liz. Maybe while people are thinking. Liz, I don't know how well articulated my question will be, but I'm thinking about your some of your summary statement of speaking to the need to have secure environments for scientists.
Mhm.
The component that you highlighted through Neptune of like the importance of a key person or persons that really help to maintain a
Mhm.
system where the system survives. And then I'm thinking about the data set that you amassed in your paper, and I was wondering if you could speak to were there indications in your data set of like who is doing the work? Was that something you were able to get at? Like what types of roles are critical to the survival and maintenance of these infrastructures? And maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I think the Neptune example is, I mean, I would, if you're going to like stick to paleontological speak, we have something called a dead clade walking, which is that it's one of these organisms or these groups that just really stagger along for this long lifetime in terms of the stratigraphic record. But Neptune, despite like the amazing efforts of the people, Johan in particular, who has maintained it, it could have been much better supported if it had either the scope, scale, and community that the PBDB and Neotoma have both had community buy-in for, but also cultivated themselves. Um, yeah, I do think that the grass is greenest where you water it. And unfortunately, with Neptune, there was a cyber attack recently, and the database was lost to a point. But because, again, the community is so active and interested, there were backups that the community had just all over the place. And then, of course, the open, like the fair data principles meant that there was the core data itself was stored on Zenodo as well. And so once again, like these moments of what are meant to be like kind of idealism, these data practices that are idealism, they saved Neptune. Like that would not, we would have lost all of that data, years and years of curation, of effort, of taxpayer fund. Like this is core data, boats and students and everything would have been gone. But we had these principles. They saved us.
Hmm. Thank you. Yeah, Jessica, and then Emily.
Yeah, this is great, Liz. Thank you so much. And I just as an aside, I love that you're saying the grass is greenest where you water it. I think that
Yeah.
just is just a wonderful encapsulation of so much of our sort of our work and our relationships. But thinking about your your sort of messages on what's needed in the future.
Mm.
You had, that we need we need secure scientific futures, secure futures for scientists, but it feels like another message from a part of your talk is that we also need to not we need a broader definition of what a scientist is and who can do
Absolutely.
science, right?
Yeah.
And maybe just comment on that element as well, because that felt important that there's lots of people that do science. It's not just we're sort of interpreting this in our Western academic framework as well. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
No, I definitely do. And I think loath though I am to use the word, it's the first one that comes to mind, but it's essentially a kind of humility, which is that when you are working, I use the ecology and the biogeography example. They're the same processes, but you have this foundational semantic issue, and like actually engaging with what somebody is trying to say, not what you're interpreting somebody to say, filtered through what you are wanting to, like not wanting, but like what's useful to you. And I think that this concept of knowledge for use rather than for communication is something that needs to happen not just within science generally or like Western science or within the academic structure wherever it be, but also it will help other people outside of academia to also understand us. Um, because we've already like practiced how to share knowledge in a way that is respectful of different people's expertises. And having variable definitions of what might look like the same thing is not an invalidation of the position you're currently holding. So moving forward with caution, curiosity, and care, I think is a really important way for having one community, but also reinforcing communication. I mean, I use it with my friends sometimes.
Thanks, Emily.
Hi, yeah, thanks again. This is really awesome. I really like what you said about data sets being representations of communities' priorities. One of the things that we're working on in this network is a paper about legacy data. And in that, we're trying to reframe legacy data in a similar way as sort of the direct output of our discipline's fraught histories, right? And so I think that meshes really well. So I wanted to ask first if you could kind of speak to legacy data, mainly data that's, previously collected. But I also wanted to ask if you see any priorities in paleo data sets that relate to legacy data, if that makes sense. So, like in the data sets that we're using now, how is
Mhm.
legacy data kind of represented in those? So, two questions,
Ooh,
but hopefully similar.
I think I've been tripped a little there. Could you re-explain what you mean by legacy data, please?
Yeah. So that's something we're kind of working through quite a bit in the paper, but I think for the purpose of this question, we could just think of it as any data that's previously collected. We're kind of defining it right now. Our working definition is data that's not being managed by the person who initially collected it, but we've had a lot of discussion of whether that's an appropriate definition or not.
That's really interesting. So under this framework, the majority of the paleontology database, for example, would be counted as legacy data. That's fascinating. I'm not sure. And the reason that I'm not sure, frankly, is because I'd never ever considered the paleontology database as a form of legacy data. Um, I would actually, under what I have understood, I would have the databases that had not been updated and maintained, the databases that had kind of fallen away and have not been consistently curated, the ones where they would have been useful 15 years ago, they would have been accurate and correct. And the integration of those, like saving that data and that effort, was how I was initially conceptualizing the question. So I'm gonna have to. Yeah, I'm not sure with the definition you've given. I'm not sure I can answer at this point. But I'm really curious to see what you come up with. Like that
Okay,
sounds awesome.
thanks. Yeah, that's exactly the discussion we've been having regarding our
Yeah,
definition. So, yeah, thank you.
no worries.
Yeah, Simon.
Yeah, actually, and so maybe this is following on with Emily's. I mean, I think within Neotoma we think about a lot of legacy data
Mm,
because Neotoma has been this consistent recompilation of data. I mean,
mm,
even from its very earliest history, there's a lot of data where we still actively curate data, but there is no connection between the data generation and the data as it exists in Neotoma now because those researchers have retired, those researchers are
mm,
deceased, whatever. And I guess like your example of the Neptune database kind of made me think about that a little bit in the context of this application of care, where that those multiple versions of the database across the landscape,
mm,
really save you when your whole focus is fair. But if you are trying to address historic legacies of improper data collection,
mm.
it's potentially a hindrance, right? Because all of a sudden,
Absolutely.
you're trying to potentially exclude data that was included at one point, or you're trying to um, you're trying to not retrofit. You're trying to like repatriate or rematriate data, whatever it is. You do
Mm,
have all these different versions of the database out there, and we're actually and people actively use those because we're working with the Paleo Fire database right now, and we know that there's actively like three different research groups with sort of three different versions of this database out there, um, that are all actively using their own version. And so
mm,
it, I guess, I wonder if you could talk to that, and I guess talk to the issue of multiple versions of the same data
mm.
across multiple databases.
Yeah. I can have a stab. So I'm not familiar with the particular database that you're using and or that you suggest the FIRE database. Um, and if there is, I'm assuming that the exclusion of some of that data is based on conversations that have been had with people who would have relevant sovereignty over that data, correct? Um,
Sorry, I was muted. No, I think I was just using that as an example of the
oh,
fact that people actively use multiple versions of the same database. So like, even if someone at the Paleo, like whatever the standard Paleo Fire database is, dealt with a data sovereignty issue,
mm,
hid that data, there are potentially other groups that are still using it.
I see. Um, That's a pretty complicated case study. I think that
Sorry.
no, it's okay. In fact, it's kind of fun to think about, but you caught me on the fly, and I don't mind. The um, For my 2 cents on this, I think that it sounds like there might be versions of it, but there sounds to be one authoritative version at least. I know that with a lot of databases, there are a series of versions, and then there's the most recent, and the most recent becomes the authoritative one. Um, but this sounds like a proliferation problem a little bit, and it's one where the community will have to kind of self-police. There is no, as far as I'm aware, there's no board of ethics enforcing fair, and it's the same with care as well. These are decisions that we choose to make about our own practice. And I would be unwilling to set up any kind of formal centralized board to police us in that way. At the end of the day, we are a loose association of people who are motivated primarily just by the same interest. Um, and yeah, provided that we create and foster a community that amongst ourselves builds what we're trying to see and then encourages other people to do the same, I think that we're heading in the right direction. Community is going to be the thing that makes the biggest change in the long run, and we'll see it through our students and our friends and colleagues. It's a long-winded answer.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
I hope I answered it. So yeah.
We've got just a few minutes left. Any final questions for Liz? If not, Liz, thank you again for your time and sharing your expertise and your work with us today. We will be continuing our webinar series, I think, in 2026. And so, as always, if anyone has suggestions on people or groups they would like to bring into the fold via a webinar, please get in touch with me. And yeah, thanks again, Liz.
Thank you for the invitation and also for setting this up. I think this is exactly the kind of thing that'll get us through. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.